paradox tied into the words faith, hope, and love. That phrase is used by Paul, who was not a disciple but became an apostle, in several places in the various letters that he wrote, or shall I say his amanuensis. A person wrote. He dictated the letters to someone else. You can start. In order to talk about faith, as Paul knew it, I need to talk to you a little about Paul. Paul is one of the most exceptional figures in what became the New Testament. He was born in Tarsus, probably in the year 10, and died, perhaps, age 67 in Rome. He became a Christian missionary and theologian and was known as the apostle to the Gentiles. He did not preach to Jews, he preached only to Gentiles. He was one of the apostles who wanted Gentiles to come into the Christian tradition. He was born in Tarsus, which is part of Turkey. He was trained as a rabbi. I didn't know that until I started looking more closely into his background. But he earned his living as a tent maker. He was a zealous Pharisee. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were two competing groups in ancient Israel. The Sadducees were the wealthiest, the ones with all the privileges and the perks, and the Pharisees were the ones who were very concerned about following the letter of the law. Some people thought they were way too fussy, that they nitpicked about everything, that they scolded Jesus for things that Jesus thought were not worth talking about. He persecuted, this is Saul, he persecuted Christians until he had a very unusual experience on the road to Damascus. Do any of you know the story of what happened? You do, Sonia?
A little bit, yeah.
Well, you want to say something about it? Shall I say something?
Yeah.
There are different interpretations of what happened, but there were witnesses to some of it. Saul, it was Saul then. Saul was on his way to Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, but in those days boundaries shifted all the time between these countries. And something happened. He collapsed. He completely collapsed. People say that a bolt of lightning came out of the sky and that it terrified all of them. Lightning is frequently in Bible stories, especially in the Old Testament, as a sign that God is interrupting daily life. Paul did not see anything. He was totally unconscious. But in his unconscious state, he apparently saw a vision of Jesus, the risen Jesus. This is Saul, who did not like Christians and was not a follower of Jesus. The more important thing was not so much that he saw Jesus, but that he heard a voice, a prophetic call. He heard a voice that he believed came from God, asking him to stop his persecution, because persecuting Christians was the same as persecuting Christ. And Christ in this voice was the embodiment of the invisible God. It's important to remember in the Old Testament that God is never seen. And in the temple, the great big temple, there is no God. There is no image of God. There's an empty space that only the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem can enter. It is totally empty other than having the Ark of the Covenant in it. God is never seen. God is only known to the ancient Jews by signs and wonders. The burning bush, the lightning strikes, the changes on the faces of people who climb up onto the mountains and experience God's power. Moses is one of those. So when this happens for Saul, he is completely overwhelmed. What is important is that he hears that voice. God's voice is the one that people recognize. It thunders out of the sky and out of the burning bush too earlier. Saul takes this experience very seriously. It was converted to Christianity as a result of that experience. 3 years later, he met St. Peter and Jesus' brother James, and was then recognized as the 13th apostle. He was not a disciple. Those are the ones who Jesus taught directly. So by asserting that non-Jewish disciples of Christ did not have to observe Jewish law, which was a big thing, he helped to establish Christianity as a separate religion rather than as merely a sect of Judaism, which is how it began. On the journey to Jerusalem, he aroused a lot of hostility among the Jews, and a mob gathered. He was arrested and put in prison for 2 years. In fact, he was put in prison many times. He was transported at one point off to Rome. No one knows exactly how he dies, but the belief in Christian circles is that he was beheaded by the Romans because he was preaching the gospel while he was under house arrest. I don't know if that's true, but beheading was very common. And he couldn't be hanged or crucified because, of all things, he was a Roman citizen. I don't know how he became a Roman citizen. He spoke Greek, he wrote in Greek, but he was a Roman citizen. His letters are some of the most important ones in the New Testament. What happened to them? Now, isn't it amazing to think about letters written 2,000 years ago, that they've survived? I find this a miracle, a total miracle. How did those letters survive? Well, apparently they were collected by Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch, also in Turkey, in the early 2nd century. And then the order of the letters as it appears in the Bible, and this is the New Revised Version that we use in theological school. They're in the sequence that was established in 150 of the Common Era. Now, did Paul know Jesus? No, he never met the man, but he became one of the most outspoken missionaries in the Christian tradition. It's interesting, isn't it? Didn't know him, never met him, didn't come into any of it until after Jesus had died. But he obviously believed very strongly that Jesus had risen from the dead. In that vision that he had, Saul was, quote unquote, indicted for his persecution of Christians, and so he stopped doing that. He had gone around as a Pharisee accusing them of heresy so that they would be punished by Jewish authorities. Well, Saul obviously had a change of heart. Now, he became known as Paul. Does anyone know why? You've probably heard of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Yes? There are many churches named after St. Paul. Paul was a Gentile name in the years when Saul was alive. Saul was a Jewish name. And since Saul was going to convert Jews to Christianity, he changed his name to Paul so that he would be less threatening. He would be less threatening to his audience. Now, Paul wrote a number of letters. Some of them have been disputed by biblical scholars in terms of whether or not they are Paul's work or if they are, what you say, pale imitations of Paul's writing. Paul was very poetic in his language, and reading through a lot of texts about him, I came across the word amanuensis, which nobody uses anymore, which means he had a secretary. He dictated his letters to someone else to write them down. All of this in Greek, because that was the language that he spoke. And the New Testament was largely written in Greek. So Paul is the brain behind all the teachings that end up becoming key points of the Christian tradition. There are people who say it should not be called Christianity, it should be called Pauline-anity, because his influence was enormous on the launching of what became ultimately the Catholic Church. There's Paul. In my family, Paul is a big name. My great uncle, my cousin, my father, my brother, my other cousin. It just goes around and around and around. And I don't know that any of them knows the origin of that name or why they got that name. Now, the concept of faith for Paul is a dynamic one. He talks about the activity of faith in loving God. When he talks about faith, hope, and love, he says that love is the greatest of all of those terms. And think about that. Can you have love without faith in the person you love? If you lose faith in that person, do you continue loving them? It's a big question. It's an important question. You have to have faith, meaning trust, loyalty, all of those words, in order to really get to a state of love. Faith must be active in love. Without love, faith is empty, he says. On the other hand, faith must be grounded in hope so that it recognizes that the first fruits of God's promises, manifested in the death and resurrection of Christ, will be fulfilled on what's called the last day. May the God of hope fill you all with joy and peace in believing, so that in the power of the Holy Spirit, you may abound in hope. The specific hope of faith is rooted in the resurrection of Christ as an anticipation of the fulfillment of the last day, that is, the second coming of Christ as we know it today. I don't know how many of you were raised, how many of you were raised in Catholic churches? Yeah, that's pretty standard in my experience. Almost every new congregation I've served, and there have been 7, I think, is predominantly full of recovering Catholics. Renegade Catholics, I've also heard people call them. Lapsed Catholics is another term I've heard. The move away from Catholicism has a lot to do with the teachings, a lot to do with the regulations, a lot to do with the restrictions that are put upon you as a person of faith. And when people get to the point that they cannot tolerate that anymore, they go exploring. And in many cases, they come to Unitarian Universalist congregations. When I mentioned the word recovering Catholics in the congregation on Long Island, one member in the room who was a French-Canadian guy he burst out laughing and waving his hands over and said, you got me, that's me. I'm a renegade, I ran away. Paul, as he became known, wanted people to come in. He didn't want to push anyone out. So he was one of the ones who said that you did not have to be circumcised to become a Christian. The other part of the Christian movement, the Way as it was called, the ones who were still only speaking to Jews, insisted that to be a Christian, you had to be observing Jewish law. This is really complicated, that there are 2 competing strains here. Paul's strain is the one that won out in the end. He traveled all around the Mediterranean, and one of the places where he spent the most time was in Corinth. Corinth is a city halfway between Athens and Sparta, who were great enemies, as you may know. They competed against each other all the time. Corinth was a central marketing and cultural center just about halfway between the 2, and Paul spent a lot of time there. The words that he wrote about faith, hope, and love that are most well known come from a letter called the Letter to the Corinthians. We have a version of it in Singing the Living Tradition. I want to read you what it says in the actual Bible, and then we'll read it together as it appears in the Unitarian transcription, which is interesting, because Unitarians like to smooth things over, simplify things, make them less pointed and difficult to accept. So this is what it says in the Bible. You may recognize this from weddings. These words are often used at weddings, but they were not meant to be wedding words. They were meant to be words for the Christian community in Corinth, which was struggling. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I am nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. Have you heard these words before? Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends, But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. And then this last part. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. The greatest of these is love. Those words are often used at weddings, as I said. I've had to say them myself for certain couples. But Paul did not intend them for marriage ceremonies. He intended them for the congregation so that it will come to a place of understanding that faith, hope, and love are critical to the life of their congregations. Let's read what it says in our own book, because those words are here in a very different form. It's number 638, and it's called Love. I will read the boldface, you read the italicized statements. 638. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal.
If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing.
If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body to be burned, but do not have love, I gain nothing.
Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth.
It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Prophecies will come to an end. Tongues will cease. Knowledge will come to an end. We know in part, we prophesy in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end.
When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child.
When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. Now we see in a mirror, in a riddle.
Then we will see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I will know fully.
Now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. And the greatest of these is love. So he's telling us that you cannot get to love until you have started with faith and moved onward down the path to love. And that love for him is the most critical. You know, it takes a lot of faith to be an atheist, one of my professors in theological school said. And I thought that was a brilliant comment. It takes a lot of faith to be an atheist. The question is, what kind of faith? What kind of faith? What is that? We know, as I said, in the Old Testament, that God was not visible. God was completely invisible. Christina Rossetti wrote a poem along those lines. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by. So no one has seen the face of God. This is even in the book of John. No one has seen the face of God. John, who comes later in the New Testament, says, but if we love one another, God lives in us. So he and Paul are moving in the same direction about how to go through the stages of your life, how to be with other people. Something else that my professor said was, faith is what carries us over the abyss. Now that's a scary thought. What is the abyss? Is the abyss the unknown? Is it hell? Is it something else? Is it the abyss of unknowing? Or the mystery of creation? The mystery of life and death? The mystery of what happens after death? You may recall some time ago I did a service about mystery and about secrecy and the differences in them. That mystery has to do with things that are inexplicable, that will always be unknown to us. We will never rationally be able to solve mysteries. We can uncover secrets and process them, but mysteries, no. A real mystery remains a mystery. Christians believe that Jesus is what carries them over the abyss, that faith in Jesus keeps them safe, that it brings them to heaven in the end. There's a saying that seeing is believing, and its opposite, believing is seeing. I think that's a very rich statement. Do you believe because you see, or do you see and then believe? Faith requires believing without seeing, like the wind. You cannot see the wind, but you know it just touched you. So if you are a deeply committed Christian, you believe that Jesus is who the Bible tells us he is. Not all of us go to that place. Some of us will never be in that place. The mystery of Jesus is who he was and to whom he was. Christians believe that Jesus became a physical embodiment of God. They couldn't see God, but they could see Jesus in front of them. They could see him preaching and walking through the streets, the roads in Galilee. They could see him in the synagogues out in the country. And so for them, Jesus became what they call the incarnate God, God in a body. He was the only person they could think of who exemplified anything like what they think godness was like. You may not know this, but Peter and Jesus went out walking on water one day. And Peter became very afraid because the wind, the unseen wind, was moving the waves. And suddenly he was afraid he was going to drown. And he started screaming. And then this is what Jesus said to him. "O ye of little faith." You've probably heard that line with regard to something. "O ye of little faith. Why do you not trust in me? I am here with you. I will get you across the water." I leave you with all these questions, to think about them, to consider if any of them have ever been part of your life, if you've ever thought about them theologically or independently, with no connection to religion. We all come from different places with different life experiences and different ideas about what is sacred and what is not. And the word faith itself is very charged for some people and not for others. No one here is named Faith, correct? Became a name. It became a name. So, in the Jewish tradition, God is not seen other than by signs and wonders, but God is heard. The voice of the Lord is heard in the Jewish tradition. Remember, all you of little faith, that next time I'm going to talk about hope and how that plays into this. Maybe we'll sing that song, "I've Got High Hopes."